Good afternoon to everyone, wherever you are, and that could also be good morning or good evening. Welcome to today's virtual roundtable on climate security in the Indo-Pacific, strategic implications for defense and foreign affairs. My name is Melly Anthony, and I'm today's chairperson, and I'm delighted to introduce a very interesting slate of speakers. But before that, let me just say a few things about today's seminar. We all know that the Asia-Pacific region is the most disaster-prone region in the world, and climate change, being a threat multiplier, poses a lot of security threats, from devastating storms, sea level rise, extreme heat, to knock-on effects such as the impact on food security, displaced population as a result of natural disasters, resource competition, among others. We all know that the IPCC Climate Change 2021 report has already given us, flagged code red, meaning that it is now a reality and we are already all facing the impact of climate change, which therefore increases the urgency for taking action. What this seminar really wants to highlight is the security impact of climate change, because it is not just climate that is changing, but rather how it interacts with pre-existing security threats in the region. From now on, climate change interacts with this environmental, economic, social, and political factors, all of which now security planners will have to take into account to ensure the security and stability of states, and of course, the security of the people. Now, with an understanding of the threat of climate change and its threat to national security, governments are also starting to design and incorporate what we call climate-proofing measures into their foreign and defense policies in the region. How these measures are going to pan out really depends also on the domestic context. And we wonder whether, to what extent is climate change really prioritized at different levels, particularly under current circumstances when the world is also facing another existential threat, coming, of course, from the COVID-19 pandemic. We at RSIS are therefore delighted to have this seminar, which will evaluate the role of climate change as a crisis multiplier and the perceptions of climate change as a security threat in the Indo-Pacific region and beyond. The speakers today will reflect on the conversations surrounding climate change within the national and regional context, in particular from the military and foreign policy communities. They will discuss questions such as the framing of climate change as a national security risk, the prioritization of climate change depending on the domestic context, the role of the military in dealing with the short and long-term impacts of climate change, and the possible mitigation methods adopted by different states in the region. Starting us off in this discussion is Ms. Rachel Fleisman, who is a senior fellow for Asia Pacific at the Center for Climate and Security, where she focuses on the Asia Pacific region and the Asia Pacific liaison at the International Military Council on Climate and Security. She will be followed, and this is in the order of presentation, by Dr. Darashni Jairam, who is an assistant professor from the Department of Geopolitics and International Relations and coordinator for the Center for Climate Change Studies at the Manipal Academy for Higher Education at Karnataka, India. She will be followed by Ian Cummings, who wears many hats. According to his bio, he has a diverse private sector, government, defense, and industry background. And current, after 33 years of being a full-time Army engineer, Ian was the inaugural climate and security advisor with the Australian Department of Defense. Our fifth speaker is our own Dr. Alistair Cook, who is senior fellow, at the same time the coordinator for the RSIS program on humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. And our final speaker will be Dr. Pichomon. I don't know whether I'm pronouncing this properly, Pichomon Yopadong, who is an Australian Research Council Fellow and Senior Lecturer in the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of South Wales in Canberra. So without further ado, can I first call on Rachel? I just also want to remind the speakers that since there's 6 of you in this 1.5 hour webinar, kindly stick to the 8 to 10 minutes time. So over to you, Rachel, please.
Thank you so much, Professor Melly, and I've just started my own stopwatch here. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Climate change is a defining feature of the 21st century, touching on every aspect of life, and the security domain is no exception. I'm going to start by talking about how we conceive of climate security from a US perspective, and how those impacts are starting to play out in Asia and the dynamics of this interplay of climate and security. Talk about how the US military is starting to prepare in a more systematic way for climate security, and then pivot back to Asia to talk about what the options are for better and more collaborative efforts going forward. So I like to frame climate change as 3 overlapping types of threat. The first is a threat to readiness and operational capacity. Military bases are simply cities and have the same vulnerability to weather and extreme climate impacts. Now, recent Department of Defense reports, depending on which one you read, can indicate that there are tens or thousands of US military bases at risk from climate change. In fact, there hasn't been a single comprehensive study done. The last reported 46 bases at risk actually omitted a number that had already been impacted. One example, Camp Lejeune in North Carolina suffered $3.7 billion US worth of damage from a single hurricane in 2007. And then just this year, Naval Air Station in California had to cancel 11 training exercises because of the heat and the wildfires. So you could see that the acute events and the chronic events both can degrade the capacity of military assets and military service people to perform their jobs, and also is starting to cause a reimagining, if you would, of battlefield and deployment opportunities. What this is meaning in terms of planning is that we have to reconceive how we protect our service members in terms of harsh weather adaptive clothing, in terms of when and how training happens, in terms of even keeping them safe in extreme weather conditions outside of the norm. So in Alaska, there's permafrost, which is shifting underneath our bases in Fairbanks, Alaska, and therefore putting service members at risk. It also means thinking about how to protect assets like airplanes in high wind, high weather, high wind to high storm ladder environments, and burying power lines. So very practical steps that people in cities would also take. Threat number 2 is humanitarian assistance and disaster response. Now, I often call militaries the first responders of last resort because they are often called upon to rescue, protect, feed, nurse back to health, and rebuild after extreme events. I don't know of any regional statistics. Perhaps Dr. Cook has a view on that, but if you look at the number and the intensity of the storms that are hitting Asia Pacific in particular, you'll see that regional militaries have really had to step up over the past 10 to 15 years to a level which was not seen prior. And the indicators for Asia going forward are quite grave. According to a recent report, 99 of the 100 cities at greatest risk from environmental factors are in Asia. In South Asia and Southeast Asia, huge swaths of largely agricultural land will be subject to heat that is up to 6 degrees more higher by the end of this century, and certainly quickly reaching levels where the human body simply can't exist outside for more than a couple of hours. And when you consider the air conditioning penetration in countries like India and Indonesia is only 10%, that means there's going to be migration. There's already internal migration to levels that I think are not normally appreciated. Almost 25 million internal refugees reported in 2019. The World Bank expects that to be over 140 million by 2050. The effects are already being seen today on migration as people move across borders, and moving across borders in internal borders in states like India can really put families and communities in situations where they're no longer with their linguistic group, they're no longer with their ethnic or religious group, and the welcome that they receive from what may be already overcrowded cities may be a difficult one. Also, the fact that outdoor labor is getting more difficult. India lost almost 120 billion hours of work in 2019 due to extreme weather, is going to bring more opportunity for economic uncertainty, social disruption. So that's number 2. Number 3, the threat multiplier piece that Professor Milley mentioned. This is where we have underlying security issues, so conflicts between states, within states, between different ethnic and religious groups, conflicts over resources, and this is then complicated by an overlay of harsh weather conditions. So that could be coastal megacities, which are already sinking due to erosion, overuse of local water, and are now exposed to sea level rise and storm surge, places like Bangkok, Jakarta, Manila, saltwater intrusion into previously very productive agricultural areas like the Mekong Delta, which is the rice basket for Vietnam, competition for resources such as fish or oil and mineral rights in the South China Sea, also complicated by climate change, and then climate-induced migration, which could bring millions of people into hostile territory. The confluence of these factors, plus unstable states and nuclear armed states, and international terrorist organizations, makes for a bit of a dangerous cocktail. Just completed work at our center with the Woods Hole Climate Research Lab, looking at climate projections in 3 particular areas: the India-China border, the Arctic, and North Korea, and what security risks are going to be amplified there because of climate change. If you're interested in those topics, we can talk about them during the Q&A. The extent to which environmental factors evolve into climate security risks really depends on how governments can respond. We as societies hire our governments to provide the basic infrastructure of society, so food, water, transport, security, opportunities for jobs. When these structures break down, then chaos can ensue. So this, in fact, is a security risk. Let me pivot now to the US. So the roots, if you would, the family tree of climate security reaches back to the 1990s with the birth of environmental security, which derived in part from the work of Professor Homer Dixon, a Canadian professor, which was very influential on then Vice President Al Gore, and got him thinking about how the US should be anticipating and responding to climate security. One of the things he did was create a Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security in the Pentagon. That office was 100 people. 99 of them were working on cleanup, compliance, and pollution prevention at US bases in the US, because that's where the money and the congressional authorization was. One person was working on the international implications of environmental scarcity and resource conflicts, because there was no congressional mandate or money there. That was me. And that was really where we all started. There was also an effort to bring a multitude of scientists into the realm of some classified data that have been gathered by the US Navy and intelligence community, particularly on weather and oceanographic data, which has since been used to monitor climate treaty compliance. Fast forward about 10 years, climate as a threat multiplier was introduced into the parlance and discourse in Washington and on Capitol Hill, and the Department of Defense and Security community in the US started integrating it into their threat assessments as well. So what the US is doing right now is starting to more systematically assess climate as a destabilizing force, which in Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin's mind demands new missions and also alters the security environment. And there's 3 efforts underway. And I realize I'm running out of time, so I'm going to talk quickly. One is mitigation, so targeted decarbonization plans for areas like energy efficiency, renewable energy, and EVs. Second is adaptation, a plan that just came out last week that's looking at adapting to security implications of climate change into all planning. And the third is identifying threat multipliers in a climate risk assessment that I think was published 4 or 5 days ago. In Indo-Pacific here, the regional response has been more muted. Russia, China, and India refused to accept climate change and security in the same context.
Sorry,
in the Security Council.
I think you have to wrap up in the next 30 seconds to allow for the others. Thank you. Yeah.
Sure, sorry about that. So all I can say is the political ambivalence hamstrings regional militaries, and I would recommend a more data-driven and collaborative approach, which we can work on exploring during the Q&A. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Darashni, please, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much once again for inviting me to this panel to talk about climate security in the Indo-Pacific. So what I'm going to focus on in my presentation will be mostly on India's positions and India's policy with respect to climate security. And since India's strategies or India's immediate neighborhood, for instance, is much more important as far as India's foreign policy and defense policies are concerned, I'll be focusing on South Asia, the broader Indian Ocean region, and of course the Hindu-Kush-Himalaya region, which is very critical to the populations living in this part of the world. So I will, of course, also be looking into the extended neighborhood because India's Indo-Pacific strategy is something that is also being developed as in the past few years. If you look at various kinds of overtures made by the present government as well as some of the previous governments as well. So first of all, what I'm going to do is look at how really climate change and security intersect with each other in this region. So there are 3 levels, probably more levels, but if you look at the pathways, there are probably 3 levels that we can look at. One is, of course, the human security implications, as Rachel also mentioned. There are various ways in which human security is already being impacted. There are already trends of intensifying disasters, frequent disasters like cyclones happening in the Arabian Sea, which used to see a very rare number of cyclones. Followed by, of course, you will have, you have floods, you have heat waves, all kinds of disasters which are having a huge impact on human security, not just in India, but the entire region, which is also having an impact on food security, water security, and very importantly, livelihood security, which is also pushing the mobility patterns in this region by pushing people from rural to urban areas, from coastal regions to interior areas, and also seasonal migration that is happening, say, from Nepal to India or from Bangladesh to India, where, again, you have a lot of political controversies with regard to the immigration or migration patterns. The second pathway that I would like to talk about is the regional security part. And I think this is very important considering there are a lot of transboundary rivers, for instance, in this region. And most of these rivers originate in the Tibetan Plateau. With climate change affecting glacial recession or the ice or snow cover in the Hindu-Kush-Himalaya region, this is going to have a huge impact on the water levels in major river basins like the Indus, Ganges, Brahmaputra, all these major river basins. And this is going to affect, again, millions of people who depend on these waters in this entire region, which also leads to further discussions also about, like relations between India and Pakistan, where, you have had decades of rivalry, military conflicts, border disputes, even between India and China. And this climate change, again, adds to the problems that we already have in this particular region, especially if the water levels are affected. So although we have the Indus Waters Treaty, for instance, which guides hydro relations between India and Pakistan, but if the water levels are affected, it can again raise tensions, as we have seen in the past as well, over various other concerns like India's dam construction on the eastern rivers. So these are some of the issues. And the third pathway, where I will bring in the defense sector and the military actors who are also concerned about how climate change is going to affect their deployment procedures, say in the Hindu Kush Himalaya region, where it's a highly militarized region, and how glacial melt, for instance, is going to affect Siachen deployment procedures, which is the world's highest battleground, or say in the Ladakh region, which again is a highly ecologically fragile and climate vulnerable region where Indian and Chinese soldiers are deployed on both sides of the border. So these are some of the areas where, again, the military is also concerned about how climate change is going to affect future deployment procedures and the risks posed, say, to the infrastructure, not just in the HKH region, but also in the Indian Ocean region on, say, the naval infrastructure and the coastal installations, which are also going to be affected by sea level rise or cyclones. We have seen in the past as well, where some of the naval bases have been affected by cyclones as well. So these are some of the pathways, but of course, there are many more ways in which climate security affects the security in the region. Now, coming to India's positions on climate security. So very often, India's positions on climate security are viewed through India's positions at the UN Security Council. As Rachel mentioned already, India is one of those countries which has been reluctant about associating climate change with security at the UN Security Council. This is because of various reasons, which I'm happy to come to when I talk about these issues in the Q&A session. But if you look at India's policy towards the broader South Asian region as well, or look at the regional organizations, because of the lack of regional integration in general, some of the existing regional organizations like SAARC, BIMSTEC, Indian Ocean Rim Association, these organizations have not been able to come up with holistic or comprehensive policies towards climate security as such, which also is because of India's own kind of reluctance to look at this even from a regional perspective. But at the national level, if you look at India's positions, it has evolved over a period of time. So, for instance, the National Security Advisory Board, National Security Council, the Joint Doctrine of the Indian Armed Forces, all these different policies and strategies or doctrines have started to categorically mention climate change as a concern for national security as well. But this has not translated into something more comprehensive at the regional level, which also has implications for India's Indo-Pacific strategy. So yes, in the Indo-Pacific region, once again, India has increased its climate change cooperation with Southeast Asia, the Pacific Islands, and other countries, including Japan, for instance. But again, security itself does not get as much traction as, say, mitigation or adaptation measures. Like, for instance, India has invested in early warning systems in the South Pacific Islands. But however, as I see in the future, India's policy may shift, especially because of its engagement with Quad. And because climate change is like a major part of the Quad's policy in the Indo-Pacific, this particular area is going to become much, like a strategic kind of cornerstone for India's own engagement with the Indo-Pacific countries. So I'll stop there as of now, and I'm happy to answer questions later on and talk about more policies and strategic shifts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Drastik. Can I now invite Ian, please?
Thanks very much for the opportunity to talk today to the Roundtable. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I stand at the moment and their continuing connection with the land and their elders. What I'm going to do is very quickly jump through the idea of climate and security as a thing and accept that you understand that, and the speakers have generally understood and conveyed what that means. and also the context and the science around climate change. I'm going to accept that most of us have already understood it. We understood the science well. We've picked up from the very best in the world, in academia and others, that there are things that are going on that we need to talk about and react to and adapt to. But what I thought I'd do is concentrate on what a defence force might do. So look at whether they're a security force, a Department of Defence, how they're made up, doesn't really matter. But if you're conducting business as a defence force and you're securing your people, and as stewards and custodians of your land, that you're looking after your country in the best way that you can, I'm going to step into what I think are a couple of broad things that you should do and a couple of specific things that you should do. This is not labelled at any one particular country, so I'm trying to make this as broad as possible, almost like a checklist, if you like. So let's start. I think the first point that I would make is the leadership of every nation's defence forces, security forces must be aware of climate change. They must learn. They must take the time to think it through, its geostrategic and its geopolitical implications. Simple things like sea level rise.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of developments.
Leadership must take the time to
remote programming.
They must seek the very best advice
one of the
and
concerns
go
really
to
is
the very
about
best of academia, the very best of science, the very best of the commercial world,
global
and seek
actors
to have
local actors and whether
the best
they have
knowledge they can for their decision making.
Commensurate power.
Second, be part of a whole of government discourse.
whether
Defence
it is
forces
just
should not
being
work in a column that they think belongs to
local
only them.
actors and then bearing
National
in
security
the
belongs,
the
I think,
exposure
more
risk
closely
in
now to
humanitarian
human security, which is a whole of
situation.
government functionary behaviour. So make the dialogue as part of national defence, belonging to the whole of your country's government context. That is, defence forces open the doors and talk widely within government.
As well. So
I think there is a need for the defence force itself to conduct their own behaviours that are mitigatory. So they should look at their own behaviours, adapt their own systems and adopt their own mitigation systems. And I'll address those immediately in the immediate term of what a defence force can do. I think there's also a need to recognise the legal framework in which most of us sit. It is currently accepted internationally that directors of commercial firms have fiduciary duties that include risk, which includes climate change. And the same thing should exist for every public servant, every senior military officer who's making decisions about their potential future and the risks associated with their business. And finally, I'd like to say that I don't think climate change is a threat multiplier. I actually go beyond it. I think it's going to become a peace inhibitor. So every nation that currently thinks that they're in a peaceful circumstance and that their environment is nice and they don't have any threats upon them, I think you should think very carefully about what climate change might do to your people and put them under stress and make the angry village potentially a very angry nation. Let me now address what I think should be some immediate policy doctrine and procedural changes that you can bring about in Defence Force. First of all, I'd like to say about infrastructure. I think you should be planning for sea level rise, 2 metres by 2100, 7 metres by 2200. And if you don't accept that you need to be planning for 2200, you need to understand that infrastructure itself can bring about changes that last for hundreds of years. The placement of an airport or a port brings about hundreds of years of potential change. I think you should be continuing to think about climate change in investment horizons. So if you're talking about building something for 100 years, you should be talking about what climate does in that 100 years. You should be mitigating fossil fuel use, reducing your greenhouse gas emissions. So when you build facilities, build a ship that doesn't sail, build a plane that doesn't fly, and build army equipment that you can link to all of those and play the games virtually, immersively in your equipment, but don't use fossil fuels doing it. I say make deliberate plans for your bases to be resilient nodes within a disaster area. That is, the Defence Force itself must be self-sufficient. If that means they contain their own water and energy, do so. I think every new facility build that you conduct should look at not only what the facility does outside and to the environment, but it should also look at the environment and the impact on the building. In Australia, we deal with bushfires, and you have to build a building in accordance with what a bushfire might do. Now we're facing bushfires, which I would call wildfires. They are far more extreme than we've ever dealt with before, and now we need to take cognizance of that. Preparedness, mobilisation and operations. I suggest that every Defence Force now needs to consider a lower energy use transports and fuels. I think it is going to become increasingly difficult to get fossil fuels. Defence Force are huge users of fossil fuels and greenhouse gas emitters, and we should do our part in reducing that as good citizens. We should encourage our staff, wherever possible, to reduce their own personal emissions. We should be preparing for what I consider the IPCC to be conservative views about what climate change is. You can have a look at simple things as a Defence Force in terms of procedures. If you, for example, as a Navy, accept that the water will be more acidic, it'll be fresher, and it'll be warmer. That does things to thermoclines. It does things that means your ships and your submarines have to act differently. And I suggest that you actually find out about that and work out what you need to do because of it. And prepare for stability operations, things that may happen in your country which need your military now, things that previously didn't. In Australia, we look at bushfires. Our Defence Force was highly engaged in the consequences of the bushfire and looking after people. Health of your soldiers, sailors and airmen. There'll be significant effects because of climate change, vector migration, heat loading, where heat loading actually has the ability to impair the judgment of those people making decisions. We should prepare for behaviours where we will have to act in environments which are a great deal more heat. Also prepare for lack of community resources to support you, the Defence Force. I don't think there will be hospitals available immediately to all of us, and therefore Defence Forces must be almost self-sufficient. Intelligence. I would suggest that every Defence Force now needs to have an intelligence view of what climate and security is. That is, seek the best scientific advice and then make some judgments that last for decades about what it might mean to your Defence Force. And you should conduct risk time-based analysis of the best and worst case scenarios for your people and your country, and produce some intelligence assessments which are consistent with what a changed climate might be. There is a place for us as Defence Forces to consider things like the Task Force on Climate-related Financial Disclosure and the Carbon Disclosure Project, making us good citizens and showing that we're aware, we're conducting mitigation, we're adapting. And I think we need to, within that intelligence and policy framework, accept that there are fiduciary duties that are associated with senior military leadership. I think there's the opportunity for a Defence Force to consider the use of the Sustainable Development Goals in its behaviour and actually be ethically framed around what that means and consider their own purchasing environment in the long term by this world accepted set of ethical frames. Strategic policy. We should consider what a rapidly changing climate might do for mass migration, the reduction of food and water shortages in the countries nearby and our own. I think we should develop policies that are consistent with what we would do if the population that was within our country was highly stressed and became dissentful. I think we need to consider the potential use of Defence Forces to protect our own environment, where that is regarded as an asset going forward. I think under the international policy and considerations, we should look at what it means to support nations under threat, what it would mean to support a nation which is losing its landmass and potentially has lost its traditional landmass. What does sovereignty mean in that case? And we should continue to try and be a good international citizen. The country, the dialogue, both the whole of country dialogue and the defence dialogue, I think needs to say that we are a good climate citizen, that we're taking our behaviours seriously, that we're mitigating and adapting. I think there's an opportunity to design forces with all of those things in mind. I think there's an opportunity to embed climate considerations in all our decisions. The one thing I would, however, conclude on, the one thing that I think is most important, is that our leadership learns about climate change. They learn and understand the implications of it to their own risks and our own security. Climate and security is inexorable. They are one and the same, and we need to understand them well if we're going to do anything about it. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Ian. Our next speaker, and I must really apologize sincerely to our next speaker, Professor Ono Keishi, who is a professor for National Institute for Defense Studies, or NIDS, in Japan. I guess in my eagerness to present all, I overlooked introducing you, Professor Ono. His expertise is in military and defense economics, having published a number of books on economics and war history, military privatization, amongst others. He is now currently a member of the Climate Change and Security Study Workshop of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Over to you, Professor Ono, please.
Thank you very much for introduction. And let me share my slide for presentation. Yes. Yeah, I'm going to make a presentation of today's presentation following the 4 points from the Japanese perspective. Firstly, I'm going to introduce the impact of climate change on defense and diplomacy, and then move to the assistance to developing countries. And I like to talk about the fishery issue as a new maritime security. And then finally, I'd like to wrap up the Japan by showing the Japan strategy for the climate security, especially in the Indo-Pacific area. And as you know, the prospect of economic gains, like the opening up the Arctic shipping lane and resource development due to rising temperature in the Arctic Ocean, has caused additional security concern. And the Russian and NATO forces actively conducting surveillance and military exercise in the region. China also has a strong interest on the economic and scientific research in the area, but their activity between the economic and the scientific research and the military intelligence gathering are blurred. So many countries are very concerned about their Chinese activity there. Japan also decided this year to build a research vessel for Arctic scientific research. As far as Japanese Antarctic scientific research is concerned, the research activity is organized by the Ministry of Education, but logistics supply is assisted by the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Forces, Japan Navy. But Ministry of Education have decided to carry out the Arctic scientific research on their own, not logistic support by the Japanese Navy. And one of the short-term concerns in assisting to developing countries is the increase in demand due to the frequent occurrence of extreme weather events. Countries, including Japan, are experiencing an increasing number of large-scale natural disasters within their own borders, and it makes it difficult for them to provide adequate support to other countries. A long-term challenge is to help improve the disaster response capability of local militaries in the Indo-Pacific region. This could result in the battle for leadership between Western countries and China and Russia. A further problem is that supporting military capacity building is difficult and often ends in failure. Although not capacity building for disaster response, a recent example is the failure of the US-backed Afghan army to function adequately, resulting in the defeat by the Taliban. It is quite possible that taxpayers in donor countries do not support the provision of long-term assistance. That is unlikely to succeed. And then I'd like to speak about the fishery as a new maritime security. In recent years, global consumption of seafood has increased and the price has risen. There are 3 major fishing grounds in the world. 2 of them are in the North Atlantic and the other in the Northwest Pacific, as you see on the map. These fishing grounds are now in high seas outside the exclusive economic zone, but rising sea temperature threatened to displace them northward and possibly move them into the Russian EEZ. In 2019, a research group of the Latvia University in the United States pointed out that due to global warming, fish catch have decreased by up to 35% in the seas around China, including the East China Sea during the last 8 years. As a result, Chinese and North Korean fishing fleet, implicitly supported by their government, have recently been moving into northern fishing ground in the Sea of Japan and Japan's EEZ. In June this year, a North Korean authorities vessel looked like a fishing boat was found to be operating within Japan's EEZ in the northern Sea of Japan. It was armed with a shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missile. This armament far exceeds that of Japanese Coast Guard's vessel, whose biggest weapon are 40mm gun, or fishery patrol boats, which have no arms other than water cannons. Another concern to fishery resources is the transformation of pirate. At one time, pirates were active in Southeast Asia and off the coast of Somalia, but their activities have declined significantly, partly as a result of international effort. However, some of them have moved to West Africa or returned to Southeast Asia and continue their activities. This piracy may turn from commercial cargo and ransom taking to illegal fishing. Originally, some of the pirates of the coast of Somalia engaged in illegal fishing. There is a possibility of illegal fishing by armed ex-pirate in the icy waters in the future. The question will be, who and how police it? And then I'd like to show the Japan's contribution in the future for climate change and climate security. Japan's strategy for addressing climate change in the Indo-Pacific region include the following. The first is to leverage the advantage of Japanese private sector. Since the oil crisis in 1973, the Japanese private sector has accumulated expertise in energy saving, which is the basis for the current reduction of greenhouse gas emission in Japan. The Japanese private sector has achieved some of the highest level of energy efficiency in the world, as exemplified by the fuel efficiency of Japanese cars. Another factor that has contributed to energy savings in the Japanese private sector is pollution control. During the period of rapid economic growth in the 1960s, Japan suffered from terrible air pollution. Regulation and public opinion in Japan at the time forced Japanese manufacturers to introduce and improve exhaust gas purifiers, which had the side effect of increasing energy efficiency. In this field, Japan has an overwhelming technological advantage. The second is Japan's contribution to HADR knowledge. During the Cold War, Japan's self-defense forces placed a great deal of emphasis on the disaster relief operations to mitigate the anti-military sentiment of the post-World War II public. Because Japan is geographically located in the path of typhoons and areas prone to the earthquake, the SDF has accumulated lessons learned from disaster relief operations. The SDF is one of the most experienced disaster relief forces in the world and has a great advantage in helping to improve the HADR capabilities of the armed forces in the Indo-Pacific region. The downside of Japan's involvement in Indo-Pacific countries' climate change response strategies is its support for nuclear power plants. Some countries in the region are seeking to increase their reliance on nuclear power to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Japan, along with the United States and France, has been a leader in nuclear power technology. However, the Great East Japan earthquake of March 2011 and the subsequent disaster at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant changed the situation completely. Since the Japanese government stopped building new nuclear power plants, engineers in the nuclear field shifted to non-nuclear sector, and the nuclear engineering courses at the universities, which were among the most popular before the disaster, have lost their popularity.
Professor Ono, could you wrap up, please?
Yes, that the fact will lead to a decline in the technical level of nuclear engineering in Japan in the future. That is that is the conclusion of my presentation. And thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ono. Can I now invite Alistair Cook? Al?
Thank you, Prof. Mali. In my presentation today, I'd just like to make three main points to contribute to the discussion. I think the first one was raised by Ian, but it's worth reiterating from our perspective in Southeast Asia, and that is that climate change has long been part of the security lexicon, the security agenda. The second one is that currently within the region, we see a lot of policy activity around climate change and climate security across different sectors, but it remains disconnected in particular ministries or agencies with limited collaboration, and this needs to change. And the third point I want to make is that many militaries in the region have focused their efforts on reactive strategies. Some have recognized their contributions to climate change and have articulated a plan like we've seen in Singapore, but there's much more work to be done in terms of thinking from the future as a way to consider both immediate impacts and then planning from the future over the long-term trajectory that we are faced with. So with the first one, climate security, we've seen a lot in academic discourse about it being criticized conceptually as a way to militarize climate change responses. But in Southeast Asia, national security has been focused on what has been termed non-traditional security issues, as we very well know in our center at RSIS. And it evolved around the turn of this century, it's a funny way of framing it, but to be explicitly articulated as NTS, non-traditional security. So although many of these issues were already understood as part of a nation state survival well before, now more recently the dial has shifted to recognize really the intersection of security threats and risks. But we haven't really seen some of these issues, particularly in this case, climate risk and climate security, having enough impact or policy salience that it should do, and that its impact on policy choices and structural arrangements in Southeast Asia is still relatively limited, even though it is becoming, or even though it's not been widely accepted as a significant consideration. So just firstly, in terms of the region, I just want to articulate here a brief recap to put it into context. So really, we saw the catalyst in Southeast Asia. Prof. Ono mentioned there the Fukushima accident that we saw, the triple disaster in Japan in 2011, but in Southeast Asia was quite well before that in 2004, which was a real catalyst, being the devastated Indian Ocean tsunami for the developments, which then became the ASEAN Agreement on Disaster Management and Emergency Response, taking effect in 2009, and also providing the framework for what became the ASEAN Coordinating Center of Humanitarian Assistance and Disaster Management as the operational engine of that regional agreement. Now, in terms of the strategic development, what we've seen is that has really been focused on the ASEAN Committee on Disaster Management, which now produces a 5-year work plan, and we're currently in the third iteration of that from this year until 2025, and currently Singapore is the ACDM chair. Under this Singapore's chairmanship, we've seen the ASEAN Disaster Resilience Outlook, which I'll spend a little time talking about here, which was conducted over the last several months to provide a midterm review of the direction of travel in the region in terms of reaching ASEAN Vision 2025 on disaster management, as well as being more of a forward-looking document beyond 2025 and its linkages with Sustainable Development Goals and the Sendai Framework on disaster risk reduction to achieve by 2035. So a couple of things that came out of this recent work. We saw through a survey of an expert survey of around 110 participants that most of them agreed that we saw linkages between ASEAN and global priorities being aligned on disaster management. Second, we saw that risk assessment and the monitoring was seen as average. More responders thought that ASEAN was strong in preparedness and response than those who didn't. Disaster prevention and mitigation is considered weak. And ASEAN's capacity to manage disasters was generally balanced, with most seeing it as average. So many of those findings won't surprise us in the region. Now, what I want to do is just focus on 3 core elements that we've seen in terms of that review, and that is institutionalization and communications, finance and resource mobilization, and partnerships and innovation. And I just want to take out a couple of things here which are under development in the region, which I think really contribute to what we've been discussing so far in terms of climate security. The first one is that lack of policy coherence across ASEAN communities, whether it is in the political, security, socio-cultural, or economic communities, and a real need for a whole of society approach that involves not only government actors, including militaries, foreign affairs, line ministries, and their associated ASEAN centers, but also outside of that. So we're looking at private sector involvement as well as non-government groups. So how is this conversation developing in the region? And it's with the idea that the potential for the establishment of an ASEAN Chief Risk Officer that sits in the ASEAN Secretariat below the Secretary General, but above the individual ASEAN communities, that integrates strategic foresight into planning into 2 main components. One, which is called the Pandora Cell, looking at immediate future alternative scenarios, such as anticipating needs and assets for extreme heat scenarios in urban centers that we'll likely see in the region, as well as a component which focuses on longer term futures thinking and planning from the future. So for that period of, say, 2030 to 2050 and beyond. And how what we do now, we need to be thinking about planning ahead for that, and really beyond, as Ian mentioned. So what will this do? It will do 2 things, really, is continue the necessary improvements in HADR preparedness, response, and transition to recovery phases in terms of the Pandora component. And the second one is to really create a much more strategic component to look at the localized exposure to the new climate scenarios in order to mitigate and adapt in this region to those new realities in each sector, including, of course, the militaries. For example, militaries can offer innovative ways, strategic foresight can offer innovative ways to mitigate military contributions to climate change, particularly energy consumption. Now, the second issue that we've seen in the region, and it's been talked a bit about in the earlier interventions, is this issue over data. And so we have a lack of disaggregated data within the region, and having it available, or a platform available that is trusted to bring that data together to have data-driven, evidence-based decision-making. And we've seen this develop outside our region in the Pacific Islands, which have established a Pacific data hub that brings together official national data and provides an avenue for international financial institutions, UN agencies, etc., to share their data for this purpose. And we've seen a proposal in ADRO to do that within ASEAN as an entity that is generally trusted by people in its member states, and that's been surveyed fairly recently. But also what we're seeing is that there remain many challenges, and one of those is the issue of sharing data, particularly militaries who generally operate on a needs-to-know basis and need to really move towards a need-to-share basis. The second one, and I'll briefly talk about the remaining two here, is that with finance, we've noticed that there's much less money available from traditional donor countries. There's now a greater focus on capital markets to provide the financing to fund disaster adaptation and mitigation, from disaster bonds to parametric insurance and so on. And in terms of government, there's really been a focus and a call for moving from that sectoral individual line items to making sure that there is particular money given to the impacts of climate change across government sectors. And the final one is partnerships and innovation here. And really, this is where we see a lot of activity in the military realm. And as we heard earlier, militaries generally are first responders, and this has diverged in the region from the Oslo guidelines. So the Asia Pacific follow what is the APC MADRO, recognizing the first response of militaries. And we also observe that the rising sea level issue has significant impacts on low-level areas that produce food. And this will affect those rural areas outside of cities as well. So progress made in urban areas may not be translated to urban areas. So there's a real need for urban rural connectivity. And the last point here I will make is that what we've seen in terms of military involvement, and this has been witnessed in South Asia, is the development of national disaster response forces, which started in India, but is now widely established across the region. And we've also seen a shift to this sort of arrangement within the region with agencies like BNPB in Indonesia, which now has either current or former military officers taking the lead. So what do I want to just basically wrap up with here is that I think what we're seeing is that there is a lot of activity in this region, but it remains disconnected. We have ASEAN as a platform that's trusted within the region, and we've heard about the activities, whether it's in the Quad and other avenues, and they really need to be connected through the multilateral platform if we in the region are to remain part of the conversation. And I will end there.
Thank you, Al. And last but not least, we have Pichaman. Over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Melly, and hello, everyone. I'd like to, in particular, thank Al and Nantini for organizing this panel. And also, Melly, earlier you pronounced my last name perfectly. So to jump into what I'd like to present today, the purpose of my presentation will be to try and elaborate on what the Chinese perspective is when it comes to thinking about climate change as a security issue. In particular, I would like to focus on the perspective of the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, despite the fact, of course, that we do not have a lot of information, but I do think that because there are much more scholarship devoted to understanding China's variegated posturing at the diplomatic level when it comes to climate change, it's more interesting for the purposes of this panel to try and unravel a bit what the PLA might be thinking. But before I go into the main event, so to speak, I just wanted to really point out three quick observations that I think really need to foreground the discussion that we'll be having today. The first is the acknowledgement that China is both a perpetrator as well as a victim of environmental insecurity, including climate change. So even though in the news, of course, we hear a lot about how China is the major perpetrator, it's the biggest emitter of carbon emissions and so forth, we also have to be mindful of the fact that China itself has been very much subject to the negative ramifications of climate variations. The second point is that China has yet to explicitly securitize, as many scholars would like to say, climate change. And so for this reason, especially when we talk about the People's Liberation Army, there are a lot of gaps in knowledge and in understanding. But to say that China has not explicitly securitized climate change in writing or on paper doesn't necessarily mean that climate change has not been securitized at all when it comes to actual decision-making in the Chinese government. And my final point really is that the right to a clean environment, and this was something that the Human Rights Council very recently voted on. And of course, China, Japan, India, and Russia had abstained from voting in favor of acknowledging or recognizing this right. Again, it's not to say that the right to a clean environment is not being discussed in other ways in China. And so what we saw, especially with the advent of the so-called airpocalypse, concerns about severe air pollution in the country, we've seen a rise in environmental protests within China, especially in major cities. And so what we're seeing here is a rise in the Chinese citizens' consciousness of their right to a clean environment. And in response, we've seen the Chinese government put forward and implement rather aggressive policies and legislations, including the renewable energy law that imposes rather strict targets when it comes to the use of renewable energy. So in light of that, again, even though things might not always be explicitly acknowledged in policy itself or in writing, this does not mean that there is an absence of debate and discussion at other levels within China on these issues. So having provided that background, I think it's quite clear at this stage that climate change has indeed become a major non-traditional security concern for Beijing, as well as for the Chinese people. And it's one that has had already clear impacts on China's domestic stability, but also raises questions about regional security for China as well. And I'm not too sure how many people will have been following the news on this, but China has already acknowledged the existence of so-called ecological migrants, right? So people especially in its northern and western cities that are very much impacted by climate variability, and in particular desertification, and who are now being resettled en masse to other parts of the country. And so it's in this regard that climate change poses, again, a very real threat to China's internal stability. And for any of the people here who are familiar with Chinese politics and foreign policy, you will be aware that stability is, of course, one of the foremost concerns for Beijing, as well as for the People's Liberation Army. So let me now go into the views that I've been able to ascertain from the military side when it comes to climate change. As I mentioned previously, there is not a lot of scholarship, nor is there a lot of policy commentary or direct commentary from the PLA when it comes to issues to do with climate security or environmental security. The closest thing that we might be able to get to, of course, are the white papers on national defense that China puts out. And so looking through 11 white papers, defense white papers, it's kind of interesting and quite easy actually to identify how environmental insecurity or security more broadly defined has been conceptualized over time from China's defense establishment. So if you look at back to the first white paper published or released in 1995, you'll see that there is no explicit mention of environmental problems, whether it be pollution or degradation, let alone climate change. But this, of course, changed when we saw the release of the 1998 white paper, where there was, in fact, mention of environmental pollution as a cause for concern and as a challenge that the country had to face. And this, of course, coincides more or less with the inauguration of the concept of the new security concept, which was much more multidimensional in its conceptualization of what constitutes a security risk or vulnerability for China. And it's from this point on that we see environment come to feature more prominently as an issue of concern in China's defense thinking. And so from in 2002, the role of the PLA, or the armed forces in particular, became a point of particular mention in that white paper, where we saw the PLA's role in forestation and planting trees, specifically in China's western region. As some of you may know, that's where basically Xinjiang is, was really highlighted as a major contribution that the PLA did. And from that point on, the PLA would be referred to in the same sentiment in relation to environmental conservation, forestation, as well as, of course, in helping with natural disaster relief and assistance. And so really it's in those terms that the PLA is seen as being quite a positive force in helping with environmental protection efforts. But again, it would only be in the kind of the 2008 white paper where climate change was explicitly mentioned as a security issue and something of concern. Of course, there was not great elaboration in that particular white paper. Nonetheless, its mention is worthy of note, in large part because it coincides, of course, with China's major kind of publicity campaigns in the lead up to the Copenhagen Climate Change Summit. And also the fact that the UN, back in 2007 was the very first time that the UN Security Council was debating climate change as a major issue for global consideration. So altogether, what we can gather from the white papers, at least, is that at this point, climate change is now or is becoming a bigger concern and something that the military would have to take into account, although it is not quite yet the topmost priority. And it should also be noted that within China's defense establishment, there are still opponents to the view as well. Some who, for instance, believe that climate change continues to be a means for the West to contain China's ability to rise and develop, but also concerns around the scientific facts of the matter, although, of course, this has lessened over time. There's also a rising group, I would think, in China's defense establishment, and this includes, of course, academics and think tank pundits who argue, for example, the threats that climate change poses to the Chinese military. In particular, the growth in natural disasters means that China's PLA might become quite resource-strapped, as it has to send its personnel and expend its equipment in support of those HADR operations. Similarly, there have been concerns over the degradation of military infrastructure, especially when it comes to naval bases and the problem of sea level rise. But at the same time, of course, the major concern over domestic instability remains one of the foremost issues in the minds of Chinese policymakers. And this is very much related to other concerns such as energy security, food security, but also China's western region, where again, you have not only Xinjiang, but also the increasing problem of desertification. I believe my time is very nearly up, so I'm just going to very quickly conclude. Overall, I think what we've seen from China's kind of defense thinking, strategic thinking on climate change, it's very reactive. And so this echoes what Al was saying earlier vis-a-vis Southeast Asian countries, in that it looks like China has more or less been taking the lead from other countries. And on an interesting point, there was a report released by the Japanese on how climate change poses a real security threat to the Chinese military. And this was something that was repeatedly reported in Chinese news outlets, especially those state-run. So I think it might still be too early, but I think there is an opportunity for learning. And this is something that we can, of course, discuss further in the Q&A. But on that note, thank you again, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you. Thank you very much to all the speakers. I know, trying to condense all your thoughts in 10 minutes can be very, very challenging, and especially since there's really a lot to be pointed out when you look at really climate security, especially from the perspective of defense and foreign affairs. So, but we will have an opportunity to come back to you when you respond to the questions, of course. And we have two at the moment. And so what I'll do is I'll read out the question, and perhaps you can just use the raise hand function to let me know whether you want to take that question, or if you want to, if you feel that a point that you have failed to mention relates to this question. All right. So. The first question here is, given the fact that climate change is already upon us, should the military doctrine, particularly the operations other than war, be revised? So, OOTW, should that already be integrated or revised given climate change? I believe Ian may have alluded to that earlier, but you may want to expand on that. So other than Ian, you can, as I said, you can raise your hand, use the raise hand function so I can call on you. So can I start with Ian, please? Yeah.
Sure. Look, I think most militaries in the Asia-Pacific have been, working on military operations other than war for some time, and they've been professionalizing themselves in that respect again for some time. I think the pace of change will, shock most militaries when we look at the potential for military operations other than war. And I suspect, whilst I would not say that the immediate necessity of tactical level doctrine needs to be made, it might be the strategic doctrine that one needs to actually have a closer look at when we think military operations other than war might be necessary, when we feel that a military might actually be required to act and react potentially preemptively to ensure that they don't have to do more than is required, and that military operations other than war don't turn into a conflict situation.
Anybody else who want to chime in here? Yes, Professor Ono?
Yes, let me introduce Japan's case. As far as Japan is concerned, no discussion is made by the changing the military doctrine for the operation other than war. But there is one exception. It's the case of extreme weather and disaster relief. Yeah, so far, Japan self-defense force dispatched several times the disaster relief operation team, but these team services under the control of local government. So in the case of the Great East Japan earthquake and the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant disasters, SDF operated, but under the control and command and control of local government. But at that time, we firstly realized that such a huge event, disaster event, local government lost its function. So we dispatched not only the SDF, but also police, fire brigade, and other organizations dispatch the assistant team, Red Cross medical team as well. But no one could control the team gathered in the Tohoku area. So now SDF still under discussion of how to operate in the case of local government, lost its command and control.
Thank
That
you.
is only one exemption in Japan.
Thank you. I think I see Dinasri also raising her hand. Over to you, Dinasri.
Thank you. So I mean, just to also give an idea of like the Indian armed forces and how does it approach climate change today. Of course, HADR has always been at the, if you look at the Indian military and disaster response, in many cases, they are usually the first responders, not even like they're called upon. They're already like there in most of these disaster struck regions. So in that sense, HADR has always been there in the operations of the Indian military. But increasingly, what we need to also look at, in like one of my articles, I look at the moves which are being made right now and maybe have to be made in the future as we look at how climate change is rapidly worsening. And as Ian mentioned, right, so the way things are changing, of course, this may come as a huge shock to many of these militaries. So in the Indian military, for instance, has already been thinking about precautionary moves, some symbolic moves as well, where you bring in incremental measures to deal with climate change at various levels, or for that matter, strategically, like for instance, put it in the joint doctrine of the Indian Armed Forces. But again, like in the case of China and various other countries, because development continues to be at the center of climate change response, and more or less it's reactive sort of response to climate security related challenges. We see that, yes, it's mentioned, but in terms of action itself, it's going to take some time to really translate into bigger policy shifts or strategic shifts in the military's outlook. And of course, the fourth level at which climate change is going to be integrated, or is perhaps being thought of being integrated into the military strategies, more transformative ways, where you also think about mitigation and others. But again, there is budgetary allocation, but then it may be not enough to deal with the kind of climate crisis that we are looking at. So the militaries will have to look at it in a more comprehensive way, and something that is, something as the other speakers also mentioned, in a whole of government or whole of society sort of approach, because they have to constantly sort of engage with these discussions as we move ahead.
Thank you. We have now a lot of questions coming up. So what I'll do is I cluster them, I think, based on how related they are. So since we're still talking about operations other than war, on the impact on security, there's a question here about the extent to which climate change challenges can actually reframe the cost and benefits to moving from one that is a conflictual setting towards one that is cooperative. And I think this applies to particularly regions where, climate change really can become a driver of conflict. I could imagine in South Asia, because it's water stress, then there will be that issue. So the question is moving it, reframing the costs and benefits from conflictual to one that's cooperative. And related to that too, is that for those from the Quad countries, I guess in this case, the US and India and Australia in this panel, where is climate security and disaster relief plays on the agenda of Quad? All right, so maybe let's start first with the first one, from cooperation, from conflictual setting to cooperation, and perhaps move into Quad. I mean, whoever wants to respond to that first. Anyone?
I can jump in.
Yeah,
that's all right.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question, and certainly one that's that we don't seem to have an answer to, despite it being clearly very important. I think the one example that really struck me was how back in 2018 there was actually a disaster management exchange between the U.S. Army Pacific and the PLA. And that, I think, is one example of how back then such exchanges, such cooperation were indeed, examples of cooperation were indeed possible, but of course in the current geopolitical climate is much more harder to envisage happening at all. So I think at this stage, and this is what we also see in China's military attitude towards climate change, at the end of the day, other military traditional security issues will be prioritized over climate change. And so if we want to see cooperation happen, we unfortunately will have to ensure that the geopolitical environment in this region is first conducive to addressing climate change as the topmost priority.
Rachel, you want to come in here?
Sure, and thanks so much for that. Just building on that response, I would argue, having worked in both the U.S. Department of Defense and our State Department, so both in defense and diplomacy, that the militaries don't want to go out and fight wars. And in fact, there was a famous exchange during the Obama administration where the Secretary of Defense said to the Secretary of State, you know, if you don't go and help these people, provide aid, invest in trust, then we're going to have to come in and clean up the mess. So it's much better to prevent than to have to sink into conflict. And I think there's always been, and there continues to be, great military cooperation on humanitarian assistance, disaster response, and also health response. So the U.S. has hospital ships that actually do a lot of work around the region. And I would add to that, I think our new opportunity is around data and data-driven diplomacy. And you see what happened on the Mekong River, where there's a Mekong River Commission that had noted a drop, a precipitous drop in the amount of water that had flown down. And studies that were funded by the U.S. government showed that corresponded to the amount being potentially withheld by Chinese dams. And then the Chinese responded with their data. And once we get, as I think was mentioned earlier, once we get some trusted sources of data, we'll be able to actually start to work collaboratively on how to better manage shared resources, be it on the HKH river basins, the Tibetan Plateau, and elsewhere in the region. And this is, I think, going to be a place where military and diplomacy and probably energy expertise all need to come together to see how do we make this transition to a lower carbon society? How do we mitigate potential conflicts over shared resources? And if I could just add one more thing, under the Trump administration, there was a lot of linkage put into U.S. and China relations. So, you know, the China we want to trade opportunity, and the Trump administration would say, well, what about your human rights record? And now I think the tables are turned, and the US is saying we want to collaborate on climate change, but we're not going to let up on the trade barriers. And China's saying, well, wait a second, that's not how we play. So I think we're going to have to find new levels of discourse and shift the rules of the game a little bit to get some of these collaborative outcomes.
Thank you, Rachel. Can I call on Ian?
Thank you. There has been enormous amounts of experience of conducting certainly Asia-Pacific wide exercises and understanding throughout, I think, all nations participating, perhaps with the exception of one or two, on understanding what happens in disaster humanitarian relief operations other than war. We're now entering a phase where we've tended to, as militaries, set that aside because militaries have tended to be participants in a game which is about competition anyway. And at those moments, what we've done is we've set those competitions aside in order to assist others. And I suspect that we're going to move into an environment where we're actually going to have far more forced hand the need to actually help each other. So the opportunity now exists, and perhaps this is the silver lining, for a less competitive behaviour amongst militaries, and one that turns inward to protecting, to be custodians of the people that we have who will be threatened, and to participate perhaps more closely in a dialogue which accepts that we're going to actually see more problems, and therefore how do militaries react collectively to support those under stress.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's a good point, I guess. This could perhaps be another way of looking at, for example, these bilateral relations or tensions between US and China. Because of shared threats, you're forced to work together. And this could, in fact, be a mitigating factor in easing tensions between US and China. I'm taking the advantage of chair to be able to address Anne-Mei Sheng's question, but of course it's open to the others to also respond. I have Al, and followed by Dinasri again. Yeah, Al.
Thanks. I was just going to make one short point here, and I guess it echoes on what's just been said, but we see a shift towards anticipatory action. And essentially, before a threat before climate change becomes a threat multiplier, we're seeing a lot more activity on the front end now. So in prevention, in whether it's in terms of early warning, sharing of data is increasing and so on. So I think there's a lot more prospect for us to be going forward in the realm of cooperation than, you know, it ending up as outright conflict.
Nasri?
Yeah. So, I mean, in the South Asian context, just wanted to add, you know, a couple of examples about the river water sharing experiences, like between India and Pakistan and between India and China. So India and Pakistan, of course, have the treaty in place, but yet, you know, we have seen a number of instances where tensions flare up. And you know, there's always third-party intervention, or the issue being taken to the International Court of Justice, or you know, taken to the Permanent Court of Arbitration, for instance. So, in that sense, it's still very territorially driven sort of discourse in this context in particular. And if you look at the India-China example as well, again, China does share data with India over Brahmaputra, but then during one of the military crises that we had, China did not share data or when the Doklam crisis happened. So in a sense, what we see is that still environmental issues or climate-related issues are subjected to some of these geopolitical rivalries, which may come in the way of open or, you know, more like holistic cooperation. And very often, of course, this is also driven by the fact that there is very low level of trust between countries in this region, and that contributes to the lack of regional integration and lack of cooperation. But at the same time, yes, when it comes to military cooperation, you have regional arrangements like the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium and others, through which exercises and other such initiatives have been started. But I would still say that yeah, when it comes to the regional initiatives, we are still kind of far away from effective cooperation.
Thank you. Pichumon?
Sure, I just wanted to, yes, to follow on from what Dhanasri was saying, but also the question on US-China, I think despite being quite pessimistic, I think what we can see from at least the academic scholarship on this issue is that, you know, in the case of water, cooperation is much more common than conflict. And I think that is perhaps something that we can extrapolate to climate change as well. At the same time, I am still realistic, I suppose, in the sense that unless our militaries have an incentive structure in place that makes cooperating on climate change beneficial to all involved, we're not going to see cooperation, right? But on that note, I think we can never do enough in terms of really hammering that point that climate change is a real existential threat to countries. And certainly in the case of China, we're seeing how concerns over sea level rise and coastal retreat can very well impact China's maritime claims and sovereignty in the region. So in that regard, even if just on those points, there is a vested interest for the Chinese government to take these issues seriously.
Thank you. We have a couple more questions. It's just to shift gear. For this is one question for all participants. How do you view the role and the critical contributions of cities and local or subnational governments in pushing for climate justice and advancing the Paris Climate Agreement or climate action? So moving away from the role of militaries to cities and subnational governments. And in relation to that, there's another question which asks how we should actually integrate climate change discussion across different sectors. All right, so these two questions, we have 2 more minutes to go. So who wants to take that up? I see the hand of Ian, please.
The first thing I would say about making it cross-sector is climate change needs to be answerable, controlled by the people who control the money. I think as soon as everybody who responds to money understands that climate change is a money issue, then many of these things will be changed. Unless you actually build something that's consistent with the climate change theme, you don't get any money, then things will change. So it needs to go to the money men and girls around the place and make sure that they keep people straight in what they do.
Thank you. Anyone wants to take the question on the role of sub-regional? Yes, Pichumon.
I'll just jump in there and give a quick example. So when it comes to the issue of air pollution, for instance, China's put in place a vertical governance system whereby it's about decentralizing some of the state authority to the provincial and local levels in order to, and to environmental protection committees to ensure that kind of local interests are taken into account when it comes to governing this issue. So there are, of course, some challenges when it comes to implementation, as is the case for any other country, but there is a clear message as well that devolution of state authority in these types of circumstances are actually beneficial to making environmental governance more broadly much more effective.
Thank you. We just have about a minute to go. Could I return to all the panelists for their last thoughts, maybe 30 seconds each? Can I start with Professor Ono? Last few words. Yes.
To wrap up the presentation today.
Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for quite interesting webinar. Yeah, and yeah, as some participants said that cross-sectoral cooperation is quite necessary, as well as military and foreign affairs authorities cooperation. So I'd like to move forward to research in this field. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Rachel, last few words, wrap up.
Sure. I'd like to end where you started, which is that the Asia-Pacific is the most disaster-prone region of the world, and military and security experts and diplomatic experts should use the gravitas of their voice to make sure that we are adapting quickly enough. Because I think we're moving on mitigation, but we're not moving on adaptation, and that's the best way to protect.
Thank you. Pichamon?
Sure. I think following on from what Rachel was saying, the issue here when it comes to China's reputation and what we see from the white papers, but also China's foreign policy, is that reputation matters a lot when it comes to determining how China acts on climate change. So in that regard, other countries have the opportunity now to set the example.
Yeah, thank you. Alistair, Al?
Sure, thanks. I guess my brief point here is that before things happen, you have to put in the effort. And whether that is in terms of building trust, building connections between militaries, foreign ministries, and so on. So a lot more time and effort has to be invested ahead of time, not just in response to events.
Finally, Dhanashree, you have the last word.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe I'll just build on one of the questions itself. I think one of the key arguments in all of this is, of course, trying to integrate the whole debate on climate justice into the security discourse itself. And I think that's very important for many populations, the most vulnerable populations who have been most affected by climate change. And I think that will really reframe the debate on climate security, which is not necessarily something that is dictated by just the policy elites or the military for that matter. Thank you.
Thank you. We have had a very, very interesting discussion. I always find these things, just as the discussion gets more and more interesting, then we now have to face time, that we have to close this. But there was one question which I thought is a nice way to close this session, and that is really climate literacy. The question from Disetya was saying, what do you think about climate literacy as an object of learning for all different actors, from ordinary citizens, business actors, and I guess the rest, right? So first we talk about climate awareness, but being able to know exactly to what extent this really affects security. Once upon a time, when you use the word climate security, it draws unnecessary concern because we're securitizing climate. But when you really look at security writ large, right? It affects everyone, states, communities, individuals, etc. And having this climate literacy across all levels, across all sectors, including military, defense, and foreign affairs, really helps, I guess, widen the discourse and makes it easier for more collective action to take place. Alistair talked about preparedness, and because we don't want to be reactive, we want to be prepared. And preparedness is very important, especially for sectors that are in charge of our defense and security. And this is, of course, the military. So on that note, it leaves me now to thank everyone, all the speakers who took the time out to join us and to share their thoughts on this very important topic. And at the same time, our audience there, wherever you are, thank you for joining us in this webinar. We have a lot more to come, as this is really a topic that, that hits us every time, anywhere. So thank you and have a good afternoon.